Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton, and this will be a little bit of a China hour. Yesterday, we talked at length about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, why we should care about it, namely because it poses the greatest threat to our liberty of any other nation state on the planet. It's bellicose, it's deceptive, it's cunning. They've taken advantage of us for far too long. We've aided, abetted, and enabled their rise. And we talk sort of more in material terms, in terms of, to some extent, their economic might, also their military strength, their intelligence apparatus is complex. Their counterintelligence apparatus literally liquidated our intelligence network on mainland China, which should scare all of us. Meanwhile, our intelligence apparatus is great at spying on Americans, as we talked about. But backing all of that, at the end of the day, is ideology. There is the physical, material power. There's the economic might. But then there's also the party line, the Chinese Communist Party line. And that soft power and their ability to project influence also involves real foreign influence. We talked about Russian foreign influence for the last 3 years. But in reality, there have been plenty of unregistered foreign agents operating here and everywhere. China dedicates great resources, thousands of people, to populate news bureaus, work for basically propaganda outlets around the globe. They put out publications, all sorts of English language propaganda that puts forth the party line and is used to delegitimize and try to undermine us. If you look back in history, we'll talk about this in a bit as well. There's serious precedent for this. If you look at the Soviet Union's spending during the Cold War, there have been some accounts from members of the KGB or its offshoots who have said that actually more resources in terms of at least the number of individuals serving their national security and intelligence apparatus work towards foreign influence activities than anything else. Why? Because if you win the war of ideas, you win everything else, and then you can fight without firing a shot. And that's why the Chinese Communist Party seeks to dominate the idea sphere on the mainland, why it cannot tolerate something like a Hong Kong, the two nations, one system sort of policy that they have. They can't abide by it, because the Chinese communist ideology cannot abide by any dissent, ultimately at home or abroad. And that's why all of the dissenters from Tibet to Taiwan to those in Hong Kong ultimately are fighting to stay away from the yoke of a regime that cannot tolerate any sort of competition whatsoever. And sadly, and one of the challenges that the free world has to deal with is that we believe that anybody should be able to go anywhere they want at any given time, that anything goes in terms of the realm of ideas, even if those ideas are antithetical to the freedom that undergirds the free marketplace of ideas that we have. That our adversaries won't try to take advantage of every last loophole that we have while blocking our ability to do the same. So, for example, you may have heard about Confucius Institutes. Confucius Institutes are supposedly Chinese cultural exchange programs that exist on U.S. campuses and campuses across the West as well. And what do? They put forth the Chinese Communist Party line. There's a huge investigation done into this, and I urge you, if you haven't listened to it before, check out my podcast interview on the Big Ideas with Ben Weingarten podcast with Rochelle Peterson of the National Association of Scholars. She did a deep dive, a huge investigation into Confucius Institute efforts in America. What did she find? You won't find Tiananmen Square covered in the Confucius Institute texts. Why? Well, in part because the Confucius Institute individuals that work there, the teachers, the other cultural leaders, are basically approved by China's educational control body, in effect by the Chinese Communist Party. The same goes beyond Confucius Institutes, which, by the way, not only present the slanted Chinese Communist Party version of history and interpretation of world events, U.S.-Chinese relations, the Chinese Communist Party historical narrative about China being aggrieved due to the West, of course, the West's malevolent actions. It extends far beyond that into publications, into all manner of propaganda that they put forth. And in fact, Also, if you follow the money, into the dollars that fund Hollywood. So I wrote about this in the past. There was a huge controversy fairly recently, it was in the fall of last year, where we were self-censoring. Chinese regulators, actually in this case, kudos to Quentin Tarantino, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood was barred from Chinese theaters. Chinese regulators inexplicably halted the release of that title there. Why? Well, according to the Hollywood Reporter's reporting, Bruce Lee's daughter, Shannon Lee, made a direct appeal to China's National Film Administration asking that it demand changes to her father's portrayal. Friends and family of the Hollywood action star have criticized Tarantino for his portrayal of Lee, saying it doesn't resemble the real-life man and is instead a caricature. And as I wrote at the time in a piece at The Federalist, that China would bar a movie on this rationale is not surprising given it's literally banned Winnie the Pooh. I kid you not, because the character's likeness to President Xi Jinping has been used to mock him. And again, to his credit, and Secretary of State Pompeo voiced his affirmation of this as well, Tarantino reportedly refused to cut the film to meet the demands of Chinese regulators, potentially risking millions of dollars in movie sales. And this came on the heels of the entire NBA, Daryl Morey, Houston Rockets, hullabaloo about you can't comment about Hong Kong because God forbid you're going to imperil the NBA because God forbid you're going to imperil Nike's business there, which is the whole basis of the NBA-China relationship in reality. Soft power has real consequences. It has real consequences in the arts. It has real consequences in sports. Hollywood more broadly receives millions of dollars in funding oftentimes from China, and that money does not come with no strings attached. It comes very explicitly, as we'll talk about with my next guest, in the way of what makes it into films and what doesn't. And you have people in Hollywood, creative industry, self-censoring on this matter. So we talk a lot about the hard power nature of the struggle against China, and hopefully we'll get to talk about that a little bit later in the show as well. But it also bears noting that there is a war of ideas that we are engaged in with them, and it did not end with the Cold War. In the Cold War, we may have triumphed over communism in the conventional sense. Soviet Union may be no more. But those ideas are as pernicious and as relevant and prevalent as they've ever been. Look no further than where a guy like Bernie Sanders is in the polls today, and why the long knives are out for him, as I mentioned yesterday. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. We'll be talking about China's soft power in Hollywood right after this break. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton, and we talked yesterday about China's hard power and their multidimensional attempt to achieve not just regional hegemony, but global hegemony. But of course, hard power is supplemented by soft power, and in fact, even going back to the Soviet Union, propaganda, information operations. Well, look, listen to the Democrats today when they talk about Russia. We know that this is an important part of what our adversaries do to try to undermine us, is win the war of ideas and use that as its own weapon. Emily Jashinsky, a colleague of mine at The Federalist, the culture editor at The Federalist, has written what I think is really an exceptional piece on China's influence on Hollywood. So first, Emily, I want to welcome you to the show, and then let's dive right into your article.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Well, thanks again for writing this piece. And I was really surprised to see Judd Apatow coming out as one of the good guys. So what did he have to say about Hollywood and China?
Yeah, it's an interesting point about Judd Apatow, because right as I started working on this article, the New Yorker's very long dive into, some of China's soft power stuff, kind of the broader battle between the United States and China in terms of soft power issues that's mounting right now, came out like the morning that I started writing this, and I saw Judd Apatow's comment and thought it was unusually brazen, because this is a conversation, and I have this in the article itself. A source of mine, Chris Fenton, for the article, is kind of an industry insider, said, this is a conversation that Hollywood is having, but it's happening behind closed doors right now, and they want to keep it that way. That's a quote from the article. And so to see Judd Apatow come out and say what he said, which is essentially that, what you don't hear about are all of the ideas that are left on the cutting room floor before these scripts even get written. because the studios don't want to deal with what happens when they take them even further or any further along in the filmmaking process, which could include a lot of different consequences. Those are the ideas that should really scare us, is that the movies that aren't getting made, the ideas that aren't getting incorporated into scripts because the studios are intimidated by the prospect of being blackballed by China, of being censored by China, or frankly, of just not having their film shown in China in the first place. So Apatow was speaking to that issue, and to see someone of his stature in Hollywood, I mean, he's not only a really prominent director, producer, but he's a celebrity in his own right. And so to see him say that was really, really, really interesting to me. I included it right at the top of my article because I think it's one of those signals that this battle is ratcheting up. Because, if you look at someone like Richard Gere, the career arc of Richard Gere is a major part of America's sort of soft power story in terms of Hollywood and China. Richard Gere spoke out in favor of Tibet years and years ago, and his career has suffered dramatically as a result. And so to see that coming from Apatow, I think is a sign that maybe some industry leaders in Hollywood are emboldened to start speaking out against China. And I think really the sad saga of the Uyghurs, the way that's played out in the media, I would say in like the last 6 months or so, might be a big part of that.
Yeah, I wonder as I think about this, and if you look at what the left has done in America in terms of forcing people into self-censorship, and that's through cancel culture and a whole host of other elements in the corporate world and beyond. We talked a little bit in yesterday's episode even about how financial services companies are trying to force companies that they invest in or that their investors invest in to bend to their sort of social justice warrior agenda. And you talk about comedians, for example, here, like Jerry Seinfeld and Chris Rock and many others who have complained about the political correctness. Do you see an analogy in this supposedly creative industry where they self-censor in the basis of trying to not offend social justice warriors here, but then they also self-censor to not offend really anti-social justice warriors from China at the same time? And these are supposed to be our greatest creative minds.
Well, there's a hugely important part to be made here and a point to be made here. And it's like when you look at what happened with Georgia. So Georgia is one of those states that offers major tax incentives for film production. So a lot of movies get made in Georgia. A lot of TV shows are filmed in Georgia. And when Georgia passed a pro-life piece of legislation last year that Hollywood took issue with, they were aghast, right? And they suddenly were saying, we're going to pull all of our business out of Georgia. Well, that's particularly rich coming from the same industry that self-censors to make money off of the Chinese film market. I mean, it's just like laughable that they sort of styled themselves as these champions of art and free speech, and yet they're so deferential to China while also being so politically correct and so just like hive-mindedly progressive domestically. I mean, it really is laughable. And so Apatow in his comment to the New Yorker specifically mentioned the Uyghurs. You can also talk about China's treatment of Christians, the Christian minority in that country. I mean, some of these human rights issues are starting to come into focus in the American media. And so maybe Hollywood will start paying closer attention. Apatow is only one person. But at the same time, when you look at their willingness to censor themselves in America just because they happen to be so progressive and liberal to begin with, and then the fact that they do really style themselves as like champions of free speech and art, but it's like that stops when it comes to having movies shown in the Chinese box office. And what's really, I think, particularly scary is those movies that they want shown in both America and China. And I've written about this before, but like Alibaba was a partner in the Ruth Bader Ginsburg biopic that came out last year. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't think China had anything to do with the script in that case. But you can sort of see how in the future, the more this type of business is accepted and normalized in Hollywood, China could start having an influence over the way filmmakers tell political stories that are relevant to America. I mean, the Red Dawn remake is maybe the most famous example, where the villains were changed to Koreans was changed to Korea instead of China. You can kind of see how some of that stuff would start to be even more of a problem going forward.
Yeah, I don't really have high hopes that Hollywood will go about challenging China on the basis of defending religious liberty. And we talked about yesterday a little bit the Chinese Communist parties, as you alluded to, crackdown on Christianity, which is by many counts the fastest growing religion in China and therefore naturally a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. And basically, they're trying to force churches to have Christianity with Communist Party characteristics. That would be the parlance that they would use. Maybe with the exception of the defense of religious liberty being in the case of the Uyghurs. I think it's yet to be seen. I would say one interesting counterexample, and I don't know if you thought about this at all, is there's a show on, I believe, Amazon Prime, Bosch. And there was an article about this several months back. It's about a detective in Los Angeles. And there's one season where the storyline concerns Chinese officials and it paints them in a very negative light. So I viewed this as a very good thing. This is Hollywood coming out there and
Yeah.
actually not towing the line. But then you find out Amazon doesn't really have business in China. So, of course, that's the only reason they would take that line. So maybe the religious liberty won't work as the thing to push Hollywood to not cow to Chinese Communist Party censors. Is it really a matter of profits at the end of the day? Do we need more people to get bounced from China in order for there to actually be an outcry raised in Hollywood?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've written about this before, like when Bob Iger came out and was talking, and I think this was November, about the NBA controversy over Hong Kong. He was like, basically it's not wise for me to say anything that could hurt my company's bottom line. It's best if we all just stay out of it. Woke capitalists are not woke. They are just capitalists. At the end of the day, it's about money. It's not about being woke. They may have progressive ideas personally, but care about the company making money. In a lot of these cases, you look at Gillette, they're deluded into thinking that the wokeness is going to be good for their bottom line. And maybe they're right in some cases here and there. I think broadly that's probably incorrect, and it's informed more by the fact that they're ensconced in these progressive bubbles in places like Manhattan and LA. But the Amazon example is really helpful because Netflix is another really great example. They will not ever have business in China, probably. They've come to accept that. And so you can actually kind of see some of this anti-China content on Netflix. There's a documentary that they have on there that sort of exposes some human rights violations in China. So some of these companies have just come to accept the fact that they will not have business in China. And I think actually that's really good because those are going to be the companies that produce the content that needs to get made that may have some political lines that would be censored by companies that do need and rely on business in China, or where there is a lot of money to be made in China. So I think that's really a positive thing, that some of these companies just plainly will not operate in China and they know it. So that's great. But I just don't know, like these entanglements are only increasing, it seems to me, especially in Hollywood. So it's hard to imagine that there are going to be a lot of companies that benefit from that.
I go so far as to say, and I said this yesterday, they are woke capital, but they're actually really woke crony capitalists because, in effect, they get all of these breaks oftentimes and other tax incentives that support all of their efforts in the first place. So they really are basically phonies who care most of all about profits, with very few exceptions. And usually the few exceptions are people who can afford to actually challenge something like the might of the Chinese Communist Party. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton here on the Buck Sexton Show. We're talking with Emily Jashinsky, and we will continue the conversation right after this quick break. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton, and I've been talking with my colleague at The Federalist, the culture editor, Emily Jashinsky, who's written this great new article on Chinese Communist Party soft power by way of Hollywood. And we were talking about the woke crony capitalists of Hollywood. I want to ask a simple question, which is this. If you replaced China with Russia in your story, how big a story would this be?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I'm actually really curious to know how Hollywood would react to that, because it goes to what we were just talking about, which is that a lot of these so-called woke capitalists are really just capitalists and crony capitalists at that. And so honestly, I wonder if the case was that they were doing a lot of business in China or in Russia, and we were essentially swapping those two countries. Whether a lot of their freakouts over Robert Mueller for 2 years would have even happened, because they don't want to speak out against these countries where they do so much business and where there's so much money to be made. So I honestly really wonder differently the cultural conversation about the Trump era would have gone over the last couple of years.
It's a great point. And you also spoke with some folks on Capitol Hill, including what I would characterize as some of the more hawkish folks on China, like Senator Marco Rubio, who I think has done some great work on Chinese matters writ large. What did you find about what the political class believes must be done when it comes to Chinese soft power through Hollywood and otherwise?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating thing, I think, to track on the Hill right now, because there are some of these sort of hawkish Trump-era Republican senators that, like the Josh Hawleys, the Marco Rubios, that are looking at these issues really closely. And I mean, they're looking at these issues in a vast array of ways, and they're looking at it in terms of like an industrial policy or cracking down on Hollywood. They're really looking at it, in on a lot of different fronts. But Marco Rubio came out swinging when I asked him for a comment on whether Hollywood was complicit in spreading Chinese soft power, and he said, "Of course." He cited the Red Dawn example. He cited Top Gun, which is going to be a huge controversy. I think when that movie is released, Top Gun 2, I think it's just going to be, I shouldn't say a huge controversy. I think the biggest controversy in terms of this that we're looking at for the next year is probably the live-action Mulan remake that Disney's set to come out with in late March. But Top Gun 2 made waves earlier this summer, or last summer, because they took the Taiwanese patch off of Maverick's bomber jacket. I think there was another country that the patch was removed too, of the flag on Maverick's kind of iconic leather bomber jacket. And, obviously, that was to placate Chinese censors. I think we can all sort of read between the lines on that. And so Marco Rubio cited that. When that movie comes out, expect it to be, another conversation about Hollywood and China. But it's really, really important largely to track this stuff, I think, on the Hill, because this is what I wanted to get into in my piece, is that I do think Hollywood is vulnerable to legislative action on a couple of different fronts. Maybe the largest of them is what nobody is really talking about, and that would be the Pentagon. The Pentagon worked with, I think it's Paramount, on Top Gun 2. And there's a lot of benefits that the Defense Department reaps when it works with filmmakers, because they can ensure that there are accurate depictions of the military. They can do training through it. They can accomplish a lot of goals through collaborations with Hollywood. But at the same time, essentially, that means the United States military was used in a prop that Chinese censors had, control over, which seems
outrageous,
absurd on the face of it. Right, exactly. And so I think you're going to have some lawmakers doing cost-benefit analyses about the with Hollywood. There needs a legislative avenue there. Eric Erickson, just to, in Georgia, whether he thinks Hollywood's relationship with China is one of those reasons to get rid of the tax incentives. Hollywood really gets a lot of tax incentives, not just in Georgia, but in states around the country. Some really lucrative packages that they benefit from. You could potentially start seeing those going away. And what's one of the most interesting things about this issue, there is bipartisan concern over it. Companies do so much business with China at the Golden Globes. Judd Apatow, those are people coming from the left, particularly vulnerable to losing some of these incentives and financial benefits. Legislatively, is that there really is bipartisan concern.
Yeah, I think if Washington cares about foreign influence as much as it claims to, and unregistered foreign agents and the like, this should be agenda item number one. All right, we're going to leave it right there. Emily Jashinsky, thanks so much for coming on. I urge everyone to read your article. Keep up the great work on this subject.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
And this is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on The Buck Sexton Show. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Peter Navarro. He's Assistant to the President and Director of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, and like me, quite hawkish on the Chinese Communist Party. Dr. Navarro, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Great to be with you, sir.
The first question would be this phase one China trade deal. Put it in context, if you would, of the Trump administration's more comprehensive strategy to counter the Chinese Communist Party's malign aims and activities to the extent the administration sees it that way.
Ben, I think you have to go back to June of 2016 when candidate Trump outside of Pittsburgh made his famous jobs plan speech and basically generally stated he would defend American workers against all unfair trade practices and specifically singled out the economic aggression of China with respect to all of the unfair trade practices that they do. And President Trump's strategy since Inauguration Day is basically to hold these countries accountable that have treated the U.S. like a piggy bank. And no country has been more aggressive economically at attacking our manufacturing base than China. So the strategy has been to first, with a section, what they call a Section 301 action, orchestrated by Ambassador Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative. That Section 301 established 25% tariffs on $250 billion worth of high technology goods, essentially the technological crown jewels of America. So to strategically, first of all, defend ourselves, defend our technology. Second of all, use the tariffs, broaden the use of the tariffs. President subsequently increased tariffs on other products to basically force the Chinese to the bargaining table and negotiate in good faith. And what we're doing here is trying to deal with what I've referred to as China's 7 deadly structural sins, the 7 major forms of aggression they engage in against American workers. And there's in phase one, we're going to hit 3 of those, and I'm going to tell you like what the other 4 are. But phase one deals with intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, which refers to the idea that when an American company goes over to China and tries to access the market, China basically blackmails them into giving them their technology as a condition. That's totally against the rules of the road. And then the third one, which has been tremendously destructive to America, is currency manipulation. So phase one deals with those 3 issues. And then as the icing on that cake, there's also $200 billion worth of purchases above the 2017 levels in energy, agriculture, services, and manufacturing. But we also have to deal with the other 4 of the 7 deadly structural sins in a phase 2 deal. That is this dumping and unfair subsidies into American markets, putting Americans out of business. What we have there is the tariffs in place to defend or countervail that dumping. At the same time, part and parcel of that is the use of state-owned enterprises by Communist China, basically to defeat its capitalist rivals. Then we have something that is absolutely, in my judgment, reprehensible, which is uniformed Chinese government officials every day hacking into the computers of American businesses and consumers to steal trade secrets and personal information. That's got to stop. And finally, China is the largest producer and exporter of deadly fentanyl in the world. They're killing Americans with their fentanyl, and we expect that to stop. So that's kind of the big picture of what we've been dealing with. President Trump, to his credit, first president to stand up to China. Clinton, Bush, Obama, Biden, these folks basically laid down for China for a variety of political and economic reasons to the disaster of this country. President Trump is getting the job done.
In some ways akin to Iran, the historical record shows that the Chinese Communist Party, which is a Maoist, Leninist party, and the administration, through, for example, Secretary Pompeo, has talked about its designs really for dominance and its totalitarian nature. They've lied, cheated, and stolen, as you and the president who you represent in the past have discussed. What makes this deal more airtight than the ones to come before it?
I think the best way to answer that question is to compare the what they call in the trade the dispute resolution mechanism or the enforcement mechanism with the World Trade Organization on the one hand and the current deal on the other hand. When China came into the World Trade Organization in 2001, it proceeded to break every single rule in the WTO book. And what it forced American companies and sometimes the American government to do is basically enter into the dispute resolution process in the WTO. Now, the problem with that is it often took 3 or more years by which time an American company would be out of business. Often we had hostile judges, so we wouldn't even win the case. That's not going to happen. This enforcement mechanism in phase one basically sets a 90-day clock. As one observer has put it, the U.S. government is judge, jury, and executioner on this. Within 90 days of a complaint, Ambassador Lighthizer is the lead on this, will determine whether relief has been provided by the Chinese. And if not, we have, and this is extraordinary, we have the unilateral authority to impose proportionate measures such as tariffs to address whatever form of China's economic aggression is being perpetrated.
What is the overlooked part of the deal, in your view, that is most significant, or what have people missed in evaluating the deal text and the statements around it that you and the president deem to be the most game-changing?
Let's go with the most overlooked. Here's the thing: like intellectual property theft, to most of your listeners, is going to be an abstraction, but counterfeit goods is the most purest expression of intellectual property theft. And there's several sections in the deal on counterfeit goods. Now, why does that matter to your listeners? Most, if not all of them, are now frequently shopping on platforms like Amazon and Shopify and Walmart.com to buy products. And a lot of the products that come in from China are counterfeit goods that either simply rip you off, but sometimes can harm or kill you. And we know that because in anticipation of the signing of this deal, my office, working with Customs and Border Protection, has been running effectively a monitoring operation of Chinese counterfeit trafficking. And every month we open thousands and thousands of extra Chinese packages to look under the hood. And then if you're sitting down now, that'd be a good thing, because we're finding about a 15% discrepancy rate. In other words, every million packages that come in, and we get about 1 million a day into this country, 150,000 of them have something wrong. And about half of that's counterfeits, and the other half contains things like controlled substances, things like fentanyl, fake driver's licenses. And this phase one deal provides us with the appropriate tools to crack down on that. And we're going to be very serious about cracking down on that. And if we're not seeing a dramatic reduction in the amount of counterfeits that China's sending us, then we know they're violating the agreement.
Dr. Navarro, we've only got about a couple minutes left. Real quick, I wanted to ask, one of the most eye-opening reports that the administration maybe has put out on any subject, I believe emanated from your office, and it dealt with gaps and vulnerabilities, and this was in coordination with some other agencies as well, in the defense industrial base. I wanted to ask, what is the state of our defense industrial base today, and what kind of threat does it pose to the extent we don't control supply chains when it comes to all of our military hardware?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, my office worked very closely with the Department of Defense on this, and The concept here is that when you build, for example, like an F-35, there's a 7-tier deep supply chain of parts that make that product. And what we did was we looked at 10 different sectors of the defense industrial base, 6 cross-cutting sectors like machine tools, and we found close to 400 vulnerabilities of varying types. So in some cases, foreign dependencies, we're much too dependent on China, for example, for some of the things that go into our defense systems. In other cases, we had what's called single points of failure, where we were down to like one firm only that could make propellers for our submarines. So what we've been doing since that landmark report is systematically trying to fill in those gaps and vulnerabilities in the defense industrial base. And the good news here is that after 3 years of the Trump administration and 2 years of a very strong defense budget, after 8 years of Obama-Biden budget sequestration and destruction of our defense industrial base, we are a much stronger, more resilient country today since Donald Trump has taken office.
And this is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show. We'll be right back just after this.